Thank you. And we will be placing this on a STEM Leaf YouTube channel with captioning once it is ready. For anybody who would like to view it, the pictures do have alternate text assigned to them so that they are descriptive. Again, my name is Jen Ball. Thank you for being here. I use she, her pronouns. And with that, I would like to introduce our very esteemed moderator today. Our moderator is Dr. Simoon Cannon. She is an alumni of the class of '97. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Clarkson and an MA in Strategic Management from the University of Maryland. She also has her doctorate from Georgia State University, where she studied career mindsets and their impacts on entrepreneurship and corporate employee retention. She is also, I am delighted to say, a trustee of Clarkson University. She serves on the People and Priorities Committee, and I would like to personally thank her for her incredible support and advocacy, not only at the whole university, but diversity and inclusion at Clarkson. And she is a current partner with the Chief Inclusion Office in establishing the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. She is an entrepreneur, a chemical engineer, a publisher, and logistics expert with more than 20 years of experience. She has led projects in artificial intelligence and big data and fuel automation, inventory management for the oil, gas, and aviation industries. From 98 to, or 98, excuse me, to 2014, she held various engineering and management positions and eventually was a global leader for ExxonMobil. She's worked in research and engineering in other global departments, including aviation fuels, marine transportation optimization, logistics and business development, regulatory fuel environment compliance, and refining. Simoon has traveled all over the world, including England, Belgium, Singapore, Australia, and Canada. She has sailed on marine voyages in the transportation of crude oil and negotiated with government representatives in national oil companies in West Africa at the height of the 2009 oil and gas marine piracy rampage. She is a founder of Melanina Organics, a company that develops, manufactures, and retails natural organic beauty products for skin and hair care with an eye towards solving the problems of atopic dermatitis, or eczema as we call it commonly, and seborrheic dermatitis. You're going to have to check me on that one, Simoon. She lives in Atlanta with her husband and two very wonderful children I've had the pleasure of meeting. With that, I would like to start the share of screen so you can see the slide of the overview, and we'll be walking through that very quickly, and then Simoon will take us through the objectives. So thank you again for joining us. So we've already done the welcome and the introductions. We'll be going over the objective, focus, and commitment. And we do ask that you think about what we're talking about today as a commitment to doing work both here at Clarkson, in our local communities, and beyond. We are going to be looking at Kimberlé Crenshaw's framing concept of intersectionality, and Simoon will be reflecting on intersectionality as well. Then we'll be walking through the questions and comments you all have as a conversation between us all, and thinking about the commitments and action items we can make at Clarkson, while also thinking about our personal commitments. Once we get through the framing of the concept of intersectionality and Simoon's reflections, she'll be moderating a rather organic conversation about that. And so throughout, you'll see woven in moments to think about those commitments and action items and your own personal commitment. Simoon, would you like to take us through the focus and commitment? Oh. We have to unmute you 1 second.
Unmute. It did warn me to unmute. So thank you all for attending this conversation. I asked Jen to call it a conversation because I think it's pertinent that we have those conversations instead of lectures. So my hope is that we, after watching Crenshaw's perspective on intersectionality, we will be able to have an organic, as Jen said, or a candid conversation about racism within that context. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you, Jen, for the introduction. The focus is, you know, you will realize during the conversation is really not about identity. That's something I don't think we can change. We kind of, are born with it or inherent, but the conversation will be primarily about how institutional structures, policies, and practice make certain identities vehicles for vulnerability. And so in this context, we're focusing on racism. And as a commitment, we should come away from this conversation with how these policies, institutional structures, and individual practice play a role in the inclusion of some and not others. And so, Jen, I think what you're going to do now is you're going to show the short snippet of Crenshaw's speech, and then probably just highlight the diagram that we have on intersectionality. You got it.
So yeah, just wanted to give everybody a moment with this slide. You will actually see this image, and this is one of the images that has alternative text to explore on the handout. And Sarah, if you have not shared the handout, would you please do so at this time? And at this point, folks, I'm going to stop sharing the presentation so that I can reshare the video. And as I do that, if you have any problems with the audio, just put it in the chat and we will catch it there. And this is about a 6-minute piece that is at the heart of her theory and how she likes to explain it to a general audience.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men. Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial, and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
Okay, so that was the piece. And now at this point, Simoon, I turn it over to you to share some reflections and then moderate our discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jen. I want this, as I mentioned, to be a conversation. And so I will start off by saying that you may see me sip this little Starbucks cup here of a smoothie that my daughter made me, because she said, "Mommy, when you're relaxed, you usually have a drink in my hand." Unbeknownst to her, it's not usually a fruit organic smoothie in a Starbucks cup. So, but I want to talk about intersectionality from the standpoint and position of Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, because if you looked at the entire clip, she goes into talking about some of the present day issues and concerns that we have. She talks about impact to Breonna Taylor as a Black female and it not being as prominent as the press that's been given to George Floyd. And I thought that it was so befitting of where I have been sitting for my entire career, and that I had to figure out ways of shifting to minimize the social injustice that would have impacted me and caused me to abandon my dreams. So if you guys heard the clip, you heard Professor Crenshaw talk about impacting, abandonment, and framing. And this to me is beyond just a word to classify another injustice within our society. She mentions that if you don't give it a name, then you can't really identify with it. And so before I even get into my successes, failures, or experience with intersectionality, I want you to think about the counter argument, because there's always a counter argument to a positive or negative term, or a very populist term that's being used today. And some of the counter arguments, if you have done some research, are, is this another judgment claim? The oppressed versus the oppressor, or the privileged versus the unprivileged. Terms that come to mind for me are affirmative action, and it's similar, it's just called something different. But if I took those as a mantra for my life, sitting at this intersection, I would not be successful. I would not able to achieve. And so what I want us to think through is not only your position if you stand at the intersection, but your position if you're not at the intersection and in certain lanes. How can you shift? And we'll get into a little bit of mindset because I'm biased with my research, but how can you shift in order to overcome some of these existing archaic structures and policies that will take a long time to change? And how can you still become successful within your career, build a relationship with your peers, with whatever environment you find yourself in? So I will give two antidotes, because you heard enough about me, about my bio. So I will not go on about, what I've experienced and all that, but I'll give two antidotes. And one is, if I think about a failure where I sat with intersectionality, I will give you an example. About 2 years ago, I was approached by an oil company, a smaller oil company than ExxonMobil, where I worked, to position, possible be on their board of directors. And I was so excited. I was like, oh, great. I'm, left an oil company. I'm going to be on a board. And it's funny because their description specifically says, I'm looking for a Black female engineer with logistics experience. I was like, yes, that's me. Here I am. Pick me. And interestingly enough, as the conversation got started, I heard terms like, well, you don't have a president or a CEO or a VP in your name, and so of your career experiences. So I'm not sure you're really the right person that we want on the board. And my mindset shifted because it had to do with framing. Here was a company looking for a position which had everything I had to offer. And they took framing and placed it on top of my qualifications and said, maybe you're not the right person. The framing I'm talking about is ExxonMobil is one of the largest, if not the largest, oil company in the world. Everybody gets management status or manager name unless you are one of 11 presidents in the entire worldwide corporation. And so those terminology as it was in that smaller oil company was not the same with an ExxonMobil career, but it was all about framing, right? And so they placed this frame without context around it. And so I thought about having that detailed conversation. Your VP have never had half the experience that I've experienced in ExxonMobil, have never led the size budget, have never managed the amount of people, and have the diversity and experience that I have. But your framing has now limited your pool of applicants. And so as we think through Clarkson, and that when we go into some question like, how does this apply at Clarkson? Take identity out of it and just think of framing and how the pool of whether it's recruiting for staff, recruiting for students gets so small because of the framing and versus the intersection and the forces that are pushing against that person. So if I think of a failure, I think that was a failure. I think that was a failure and a prime example of intersectionality. If I think about successes, I went into corporate America thinking I had nothing to lose. I am a Black, I am a female, and I always say I'm a triple minority. I am ambitious. Which can be an Achilles heel if people are threatened by it, right? So I said I'm a triple minority, right? So whenever I found myself at an intersection where they were looking for a female for a position, or they were looking for a minority and a Black male was chosen, I was like, okay, I'm in the lane where the policies and the practices were against me. Let me just jump over to this lane. I may be successful, I may not, but guess what? I have nothing to lose. I'm a triple minority. And so, the times when it was successful were times when they were looking for that, but they didn't say, I want a Black female like this board said. This board said, I wanted a minority and I wanted a woman in this position. There was only one time ever in my career, while in corporate America, that I experienced someone coming to the table, coming to a promotional meeting and said, I want a Black person and I want a female. And unfortunately, that person who asked for a Black person and a female was a Black male. And that Black male went on to head up National Society of different Black organizations in academia and in the US worldwide. But they had a vision, they recognized that intersectionality and asked for that specifically. And reactions were all over the table. Yes, I did get the position. Yes, I did do what I was compelled to do in terms of performance, but that was the only instant that I heard that publicly. Now, there probably have been times in my career where that conversation happened behind closed doors. And I'm happy that it happened, and I'm happy that I was afforded those opportunities, but I can tell you more time than less, those opportunities came because I decided to get out of the lane that restricted me, that would have abandoned me, that would have impacted me socially. And so when we think about intersectionality and what it means for folks that doesn't stand at the intersection and maybe sit in other lanes or have the privileges, is think of how that impacts the person socially. It becomes a social injustice conversation where we can shape other folks and ourselves social experience and understand the framing that we put on these individuals so that we can help to shape the policies and practice that prevents it. And when they do get out of those lanes where those policies and practice are slow to move, how can we continue to encourage them to grow in their efforts? So I will stop there and get off my soapbox for a minute and just ask, anyone who wants, and I think I see Dr. Powers had reached out to me here, so I'm gonna try and see if I can, okay, so I have a question. Simoon, do you feel used when it is clear that you are being sought for your minority labels than your true capabilities? Do I feel used? Just for a short period. It's really short-lived. Only because I know that once I can get into that position, I can be a point of influence. And if I can be a point of influence and be an example of creating a comfort zone for you to choose others like me, then I'm okay with it. So I hope that answered your question, Dr. Powers. But yeah, it's very short-lived. Just like my family would say, you have no shame. Because if I am mad about something, it's very short-lived. Because to me, it's a motivation for creating a better environment, not just for myself, but for others. I'm always looking back. And so I'm always saying, how can my performance in this position now open up the door for others? So if those are the only questions I have so far, I would ask, anyone, if you can just summarize to me your understanding after hearing me, after hearing Professor Crenshaw, your understanding of intersectionality in, 1 or 2 sentences, and, what has that looked like for you?
This is Sue Powers. I'll follow up. I asked my question because decades ago, when I came to Clarkson, I was accused of getting my job because I was a double check mark. And I'll tell you, that hit me really hard. And so I appreciate your answer, but that's not how I felt at all. And I don't think that I was hired because I was a double check mark, but that's what I was told. And that's considered disabled and female, especially in engineering nearly 30 years ago. So that was hard on me. So it's a different intersectionality, but I've been feeling that for a long time without having a name for it.
Yes, I appreciate your comment, Dr. Powers, and I will say, I'll give another angle to how you felt. There are times when I felt like that, but not because I got a job, or I've been given a job and I've been told that's why I got the job alone. I really always focus on action impact over words impact. And, it probably is partly due to my upbringing in Jamaica, where I did not face racism growing up. And I really felt true racism when I came to the United States in school. But my reaction is more towards action impact, and I'll expand. Similarly, I was told that I got my job at ExxonMobil because I was Black and they were trying to meet a minority quota. Did it hurt my feelings? I just thought the person was being bitter and mean. And yes, it made me feel like it was unfair. But then that person went on to impact my grades because they wanted to prove to me that you weren't worthy. That hurt me the most, because now you have used your words, but now you've backed it up by action. So game on. But what I can tell you, what it did for me was it created a sense of fear in succeeding on a path where I would have typically gone in as a chemical engineer. It really set me back in terms of, I can't do that because I didn't get an A, and so it took me on a different path, and I wanted to be, because of that, Dr. Powers, I felt always like the underdog because I did not perform academically this way, which had barely anything to do with my academics and more to do with that person wanting to put the nail on the coffin. But what I found is earlier on in my career, I steered away from those career paths that would allow me to use that learning, and which was typical for chemical engineers. But at the end of the day, because I always felt like an underdog, I made sure to do really great at the area I was in until those engineers that took those typical path end up working for me, within 5 to 6 years. So I do know where you're coming from, and feeling where you are, to me, is when you pile action on words, that it becomes inhibitants for me. Anybody else? Oh, I see a little hand. Let's see if I can. Oh, Augustine. You're mute. And Annie, I will get to you next. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip over you there.
Thank you so much, Simoon. Good to see you. So in terms of your question, I understand intersectionality as yet another layer, of fortress of discrimination, right? That certain people, in this case, African American woman actually sits at that intersection, but you could use that for all other intersections, whether it is national background and and so forth, and the ones that are mentioned. Now, my question to you though is, I can appreciate your success and maybe a little failure at navigating that that intersection, and we can also look at individuals within the society that have stepped out of those lanes, to try to make good or to do better. But the bigger question though is, if the structural aspects, of injustice are not addressed fully or rooted out, okay, would we really solve the problem longer term?
No. The easy answer is no. Those structural problems have to change. The reality is it's a slow process to change. And so I do believe that we have to address the fundamental or identify the fundamental restrictions that these structures and policies present, and try to rewrite or reframe them to be inclusive. So no, if they continue to exist, the process is not going to change. But the reality is it is a slow process, and we have to identify where the sticking points are within those policies, which creates a sense of segregation or non-inclusive behaviors.
Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, Annie?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm trying to balance so that I don't have a conversation with all of your hobbies. So I watched a video before jumping in here, and I think that what was interesting for me is not always, but I've had an understanding of what intersectionality is. I echo Augustine's comments that I think of, it's this combination of identities, and it can go, between LGBTQIA+ and background and religion and so forth. But I never heard it broken down as to where the ideology came from. The actual idea of the intersecting roads and what that added as a layer for me that I'm still frankly thinking about. I have no specific revelations about it, but is how that includes the services driving down the road that hit that intersection, right? And so as I work in student affairs on campus, as I think about that from a student affairs and a student experience perspective, I started thinking a lot about the emotional burden our students have already, right? Like we talk about the emotional tax our POC, our minority students face, and how the intersectionality can double that down, and how they're already spokespeople to try to get these services, which we shouldn't have to be, but they are. And so if they have to focus, or if they feel like they have to focus on this one part of their identity, are we as administrators doing them a disservice when we don't identify the way that the services intersect? And like that's kind of my half-baked place that video took me, that I'm still processing. But I think that that's so far what I've kind of already got added to the conversation in my mind as I think about it from what we can do at Clarkson and services for students.
Annie, your comment is spot on. One of the things that Jen asked me to talk about was how did I bring intersectionality in my own management style? And so you're thinking through that. And if I just highlight a couple of points, it's always at top of mind, only probably because I live in this space. And so, but on the flip side, I always try not to make decisions around being the angry Black female manager, right? And take Black out of it, just that B word female that no other female can work with. Again, we're having a conversation, so we can be candid here, right? But I try not to, regardless of their reaction to my management, whether they think I should be there or not, I try not to respond, whether it's from a performance perspective, whether it's from a promotional perspective, only because that's always at the top of my mind. And I was like, I do not want them to get that impression. The other thing that I always try to do is I try to ensure that there's a racially diverse pool of candidates in whether we're talking about promotion, whether we're talking about hiring, and if I can't, and qualified, and if I cannot find that qualified individual to add to the pool, sometimes we don't end up hiring, but they have to be in the conversation. They have to be in the pool. And even if I can't find that person, you know, here in the United States, in the past, I have looked at, you know, from the Marine Services, look at graduates coming out of the Puerto Rico Management School of Marine to bring persons of color into the pool, because we need to have that conversation of qualified individuals that I diverse into the pool. And then the other things I did, you know, at Clarkson and probably elsewhere, they have mentoring programs, and they're formal, and you meet with your mentors once a week, and you talk about, okay, those are great. A lot of times, if your mentor is of a different race, if you're a Black individual and your mentor is white and they have influence and sponsorship, those mentorship programs can be great because it helps to open up your perspective of, you know, sharing what you know and seeing opportunities, and therefore allowing them, because they have that platform, to take it forward. What I have done as an African-American female is provide the coaching, being the sounding board, being that afternoon 2 o'clock coffee, you know, chat like, ooh, I had the day from you know what, because that's some of the interesting touch points that these individuals need to not feel like they're in a socially injustice position. You know, they will get the formal mentoring from the company, from the school, but they need to feel that they're not always in an injustice position socially, because that will change their mindset. That will change their conversation that they have and their interaction with others. And if we can, you know, approach it from that standpoint to get that comfort zone for them, then it helps them to overcome these lanes that are traffic locked. So that was a great lead-in. I want to ask to hear about other intersections that you see at Clarkson, both within the faculty or student interactions.
Simoon, can I ask a question here? Okay.
I don't know, Tony. Yes, you may.
Thank you, of course, for doing this. It's inspirational. It's energizing. So probably state the obvious. If you're at an intersection, do you feel you bear more burden than one of the lanes? And therefore, should we, at any place, but particularly Clarkson, should we be particularly conscious of people that are at an intersection and support them more and do more for them? Or are they so resilient like you that they seem to rise above it? So, any comments on that?
Yes, the answer is yes. They are not so resilient that they rise above it unless they have other social support, whether it's through family. I had a mother who was like, so what? So they said what, you know? And so it translates into me, okay, so what? But a lot of individuals do not have that. And so yes, if they sit at that intersection, they need the added support. They need the added, you know, policies and practices around them that says, you can do it if you just if you make this adjustment, if you can see this path forward. And believe you me, I had that at Clarkson. I explain that all the time. I had that through Vicki Clark in the minority office. I had that through the Career Center and the ladies there. I had that through Dr. McCloskey. I had that support that when other professors says, you're doing this because you're Black, or, you know, I had that support. I would run to Dr. McCloskey's office and I would be like, and he would see my face and he's like, okay, Simoon, come on in, you know? And I had that from the student affairs office when, you know, I couldn't get along with my roommates at the townhouse. I had that support. So yes, Tony, if people are not going to seek it out like I would, because, you know, I had a mother who said, so what? Go find your own lane. You have to build that support. And the majority of the individuals who sit at the intersection does not have that support. So let me hear more from the faculty, what your thoughts are on, whether you've seen intersectionality play out, what that has been for you. Even if you don't sit at the intersection, it is important to hear your perspective. I'm gonna start calling on people if I don't see these little hands going up. John, I can see your video, so I'm gonna call on you. Dempsey? Unmute. There you go. Do you want to share anything?
Well, I will share, I don't know if it quite pertains, but in a class I was teaching, this is a rare experience really, and not one I would like repeated. I give in-class exercises. And actually I start the class with an in-class exercise. And I had a Black female student, and what I expect is that the students you're sitting near to, you work together. Well, I said to her, because she was not working with those around her, and I eventually said to her, what the way this works is that you work with people, and you can go and walk over there and ask that. If you know that's a bright student over there, you can go and ask them. And she just said, they won't want to work with me. And I guess I failed because I couldn't get that situation changed. So I guess my training was insufficient to get her to get into the spirit of things, but she felt that these, and I guess they were white students sitting around her, that they would not want to work with her. So I guess that's some kind of intersection. How do you solve that?
I wish I had the answer for 1,000 words, because that's a very real, everyday occurrence at a predominantly white school, which is what Clarkson is, right? And so if you're in a team, the chances are you're going to be the only minority in that team. And unfortunately, just pulling back from my experience is I always ended up in a team that was diverse. My team had probably, the Rainbow Coalition. We always had a representative. We went to lunch together. All of us, watch all the Black comedy shows on a Thursday night at my townhouse, and then go do work, regardless of their background. And so how you solve that in a classroom is you almost have to intervene with the students that are being exclusive. You don't want them to feel, oh, we're pointing finger because you want to include this one Black student, but you want them to recognize that the workforce does not look like just them. That in order to get full collaboration, full understanding and learning, you're gonna have to include folks that don't look like you, and that will make your team better. But as the professor, unless you are able to translate that for those students, they're not going to be inclusive. What I've seen, and I'll dumb it down from the university level and bring it down to what I've seen with my kids' school and classroom, is you force an outing to build that relationship outside of the academics. So it's almost like, okay, we're all gonna go out on the lawn one afternoon and we're gonna play this really silly game. But you have to create a sense of comfort socially. Again, we get back to the social injustice. Socially, to say, oh, this is so that the white students can look at the Black students and say, oh, she's another person just like us. Visually, she may look different, but we have commonalities. Unless you can create those commonalities within the room of your classroom, it's tough to break what you experience. And so an example that I've used in corporate America is every time we have a network event, I would do you know, hey, here's your name. You have 6 letters, and your, you know, Simoon is my name. And I would write descriptors against my letters. And, you know, Simoon stands for sunshine, because I'm always laughing and I'm always happy, even when I'm not, right? But, you know, O stands for oil, because I have extensive oil background. And you will hear a student says, hey, my dad worked in the oil industry, or, you know, I know someone that worked on an oil rig. There you found that commonality point. And so now that person, whether it's the Black female or the white female who's not able to connect, are able to go over each other and say, hey, where did your dad work? Or, and that's where you form the opening of the conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for pinch hitting, because I did call on you and it wasn't
That's fine. That's
quite
fine.
fair. Stephanie?
Hi, thank you. I have a question. So, you know, part of what we're tasked to do through a grant we have is to support women faculty. And, you know, of course, they recognize intersectionality as part of the funding. And so, I mean, I kind of think of, you know, Clarkson as a business. We have professionals, you know, faculty, staff, right? And so what do you think are sort of the kind of things that can make a big impact in changes to policies and practices that, you know, you know, I know students are important too, but, you know, I want to kind of shift the focus to the faculty and staff. You know, what have you seen that could really make a difference when you put on the intersectionality lens?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that, because I've been burning to get to it. No, but it's interesting that you know, Clarkson as a school body, you would not think that intersectionality would be, you know, top of mind like it is, but it is. And from a woman perspective, okay, so I talked about how important it is for the social, comfortable space that each faculty need to sit with each other in order to communicate. And, you know, I have started throwing out anecdotes, if Tony may afford me, to the board about having, you know, these social engagements, not forced by Tony and his crew necessarily, but engagement within that the faculty can come up with, or even what we call a safe space culturally, to come have a drink, lounge, you know, not, you know, be in your suits and your jackets to, you know, talk about academia, but create that social environment to have comfortable conversation. But beyond the social piece of it is around the hiring practice and policies, okay? And so I have started looking at, okay, I've reviewed Clarkson's protocol in hiring faculty, you know, and the different levels of faculty that's being hired. And I had lots of questions. And the questions have stemmed around highlighting, well, this is why you don't have a lot of females, or this is why you don't have a lot of Black females, or this is why you don't have a lot of Latinos, because of the limitation that it places on the hiring practices. It should not negate research rigor and prowess and publication that all the other universities that we compare ourselves do. But what it should include are the aspects of specificity around research that has been done, which may not be as wide and well known, but may be vital for educating our students and allowing us to think about pushing Clarkson in the future. And so if to answer your question simply, when we look at policies and practices, I would really relook at what is coined as the rigor for someone to be hired as faculty at the different levels, and really look at the contribution and where it could take our students and how it could place Clarkson on the map for really being more focused than being broad. Does that answer your question? I try to answer it 2 ways, one from a social aspect and one from a policy perspective.
No, yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I was thinking about. And I know I've sat on hiring committees, and it really is a struggle, you know, and I think, as I understand, we don't really have much information on the intersectionality of the potential candidates. You know, I mean, we don't know even basic things like if they're male or female, and so, or, you know, gender neutral, or and so, you know, I understand what you're saying, like be kind of open-minded as to thinking outside what might be a traditional resume. So that makes some sense. But, you know, maybe we could drill down a little if you have some suggestions on how to help us with that.
Okay, no worries. I'll be happy to talk about it some more.
Thank you.
So
all right, we have 5 minutes. Jen, is there anything specific you'd like me to cover, or?
You know, when you and I have talked about this, is that we had some conversations about the silencing, which is a reflection, I think, of the invisibility sometimes, or the double equation people do. So in terms of the intersectionality that you were talking about, is like not just being called the B word, but being, you know, the angry Black woman B word, right? Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of pointing people to things, what would you say about, as people look at not only policy, but the practices we have around the university and our own personal practices, what would you say about when people are silent? What should they think about there?
Yeah, Jen's drawing from a conversation we had around when someone is an expert in a certain area, and they are invited to a meeting, but everyone in that room other than that person becomes the expert because they need to, you know, demonstrate what they know. And so the person who's an expert, if they are not a part of that social fabric of that group, then they tend to be silent, because now they feel like their voice isn't important. And when they don't have that personal relationship with others in that group, they're super quiet. And so I told Jen that I have been in that situation where, you know, I was in charge of, you know, environmental concerns for ExxonMobil. And when there was a big debacle or a spill, you know, I created the documents, I created the background, and I go into the room and no one called on me. They basically spoke to what I created. And so I took, you know, I sat back and I said, okay, you guys got it. Knowing that half the things they're saying and how they interpreted what I create was wrong, and it would have created some exposure, I said, okay, that's what you want. And I became silent. And I would leave the room and they would execute, and they're like, but Simoon, I said, no. You know, I would love to give you my perspective on what I wrote, but that wasn't the case. So how do you overcome that? Is it gets back to the conversation or the answer I just gave around, if you have an expert in the room, regardless of what they look like, allow them to have a say. And if you notice that they're not having a say and you're aware of that intersectionality, engage them into the conversation. Don't get so blindsided, like who's in the room, who's watching, should I say something? But there is a person that can be active and engaging and have the answers, quote unquote. You have to bring them in the conversation if you're leading that discussion. Augustine, it sounds like you have something you want to highlight.
Just a quick one. Sorry to, you know, feel like I'm speaking too much. The question of, it's what's still going on in my mind. How do you square intersectionality, which is a framing issue, right, with the notion of color blindness or gender blindness, you know, so, you know, which is actually the other way, right? If somebody comes in and say, well, I don't see gender and I don't see color, meaning I'm non-racist and I'm non-sexist. How does that go against, you know, the notion of intersectionality, which presumes that there are these categories that are based on lanes that are there and the intersections with them. The guy basically says, I don't see any lane.
Well, what the guy, let me paraphrase, or really explain to you what the guy's really saying is, there's intersectionality, but I don't care about it. because to say I don't see color or I don't see race is saying that I do see it, but I'm not going to operate in a sense that, you know, that makes you feel that I am being racist or, you know, I'm seeing color. It's just owning up to the issue. If you have to say it, you just owned up to the issue, which should create pause. It should create pause for everyone in that room to say, okay, how can our approach be able to overcome this one person's limitation so that it doesn't impact the entire group? And it becomes a collaborative event because it's just an announcement of what they are or what their lens are and how they will frame the meeting. And so, you know, it's just like saying I have Black friends, or I have, you know, we joke about it all the time, but if you have to tell somebody you have a Black friend, then you probably don't really have a true Black friend. So if you have to say it, then it's just an announcement of something else, and recognizing that these named, you know, things like intersectionality and things that are out there like that should bring pause to a meeting, or should bring pause to a group to say we should address it this way.
Okay, thank you.
So if, you know, I will close, if that's okay, Jen, in saying that I do hope this conversation continues, and we really need to make it a conversation to keep talking about what we see and how we can impact change. I would say that each of you, I would like you to just walk away from this conversation with thought and reflection, and make suggestions to other conversations we can have around solutions. And we can make it as structured as you want, or as conversational as you want. I'm willing to work with Jen. I'm willing to work with Tony in terms of finding the right long-term solutions to addressing some of the issues that are top of mind because of, you know, social injustice that is out there, but also what's gonna really put Clarkson on the map and push us forward into being inclusive.
Well, Simoon, thank you very much. Again, I want to thank you for being willing to be a part of this and so many other efforts here at Clarkson. I thank everybody for being here to listen, to think, to reflect, and I really hope that you take up Simoon on coming up with your commitment. You've already got me thinking about some things that I will do based on the conversation that we just had. So look for some of those things in the diversity, equity, and inclusion resources we've been putting out weekly. Look for more things from the STEM Leaf Advanced Group, and let us know what else you are interested in. Sarah, thanks again for doing the organizing. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Stephanie Shuckers, Laura Attinger, and Bill for being a part of the lead team. And of course, Robin Hannigan, our lead PI on this grant. So thank you all very, very much. And Simoon, can't wait to talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.